My name is Jyotsna Pandey, and I serve as the Community Programs and Public Policy Director for the American Institute of Biological Sciences. I've corresponded with several of you over email regarding our summer advocacy event, the 15th Annual Biological Sciences Congressional District Visits. Thank you for joining us for this live online training for that event. Before we started, I just wanted to go over a couple of housekeeping announcements. We are recording the webinar. And the entire presentation, along with the Q&A session, will be posted on the AIBS website if you want to refer to it in the future, as well as for participants that are not able to join us for the live webinar today. I ask that you all remain on mute during the presentation to avoid any background noise. And in case you're having any trouble with your audio or any other sort of technical problems, please use the chat icon at the bottom of your screen to reach out privately to my colleague, Diane Bozenjak, who will be our IT support for today. There will be a Q&A session at the end. So if you have any questions regarding the content of the presentation or about the event, please feel free to use the chat to enter your questions, and you may, feel free to put in your questions during the presentation. That's fine, but I might not see them until the end because I'll be sharing my screen. But I will certainly try to address all of them at the end of the presentation. And again, feel free to raise your hand and use the raise hand function and just ask your questions verbally as well. That would be fine too. Again, any issues, any technical issues, just feel free to chat Diane, and that's all in terms of logistical information. So let's get started. So before we sort of get into the training program or training portion of this program, let me give you a little background information about the event to provide some context about what the initiative is about. So this will be the 15th year that AIBS has organized this event. As a result of COVID, we had been offering this as a hybrid event between 2021 and 2023, where participants had the option to do an in-person meeting or a virtual meeting. This year, we're returning to a fully in-person event, given that in-person engagements are far more effective for advocacy and relationship building with offices. This event enables participants to meet with both their federal and state lawmakers, including U.S. senators, House representatives, as well as state delegates or representatives and state senators. Participants have the option to meet the lawmaker in their local district office or invite them out for a tour of a research facility, lab, field site, or museum. We are pleased again to have over 100 scientists participating this year. It is always good to see a strong participation from the scientific community. We have a pretty decent geographic diversity this year, with 21 states being represented by at least one participant. This event really complements some of the other events and initiatives that AIBS and our sponsors are engaged in, including the annual Congressional Visits Day, which involves doing Hill meetings here in Washington, D.C. every spring. And AIBS started the district visits event 16 years ago when we realized that there were additional scientists, researchers, professionals, postdocs, students who really wanted to be involved in science policy but couldn't necessarily travel to DC to meet with their members of Congress in person. So we started this event to help facilitate those kinds of meetings in their home districts, and a few years later expanded it to include state elected officials as targets for some of these meetings and tours. So we're very pleased this year to once again have a robust list of sponsors for the event. I would like to acknowledge the contribution of these societies and organizations that include the American Society of Primatologists, the American Society of Plant Taxonomists, Botanical Society of America, Florida International University Institute of Environment, the Harvard University Museum of Comparative Zoology, the Natural Science Collections Alliance, Organization of Biological Field Stations, Society for the Preservation of Natural History Collections, as well as the Society for the Study of Evolution. All of these groups made financial contributions and helped with the outreach for these events, which we really appreciate. And if you're a member of any of these organizations, thank you for, special thank you for taking part in this event. This event helps to serve several needs within science policy. At the most basic level, it's an opportunity for scientists to educate lawmakers at the state and federal level about science, how it is important, and how it benefits society. Many of you are participating in this event because you want to promote federal and state investments in research or science education programs, and this is an excellent platform to do just that, not only to demonstrate to lawmakers how science happens, but also how tax dollars are used to benefit their district or their state. We also recognize that this is a valuable opportunity to support and train advocates for science, particularly graduate students. I know that there is a lot of interest from grad students in getting involved. We want to harness that energy and train people to be effective communicators of science and work well with policymakers. And the webinar today is, of course, a part of that effort. Now, meetings and tours also help to personalize science and put a face on science. So, it's an opportunity to show lawmakers how science happens, what it looks like, and who are the people engaged in that process. There are not many elected officials who have backgrounds in science, so many of them don't know what the process is like, and they might have stereotypes about who scientists are, and this is really a great opportunity to bust some of those myths, especially for those of you who are hosting tours at your research facilities. Also, meetings are an effective means of communicating with lawmakers. Meetings, meeting face-to-face face-to-face with lawmakers are perceived to be the most effective means of influencing the thoughts and potentially voting history of elected officials. There have been surveys that have been done by nonprofit and nonpartisan organization called Congressional Management Foundation that has looked at a wide array of advocacy techniques that are used, and congressional staff were asked about what exactly is going to change their boss's mind on an issue. And consistently, congressional staff have indicated that an in-person visit by a constituent has some or a lot of influence. And this holds true whether you're doing a meeting in Washington, D.C., or you're doing it back in the district. Now that I've given you some sort of background about the event, let's delve into the content about science policy. So most of you already probably recognize that the federal government and state governments, to a lesser extent, play an outsized role in science. Because Congress controls federal expenditures, ultimately they are the ones determining what the budgets are for science research programs and education programs, and they determine how much funding agencies have to put into particular grant programs. So we all know that getting a grant is extremely competitive. Roughly 20 to 25% grants are funded within a number of federal research programs at the NIH or NSF. And those decisions are not necessarily being made by the agency, but have a lot to do with what elected officials are deciding to do higher up in the food chain. Elected officials are also making determinations to some extent about what research areas get prioritized. Are they putting money into climate research or AI or agriculture? Even within an agency, there are differences in terms of, or there are prioritizations in terms of what gets funded. For example, a few years ago, the National Science Foundation was heavily pursuing innovations at the nexus of food, energy, and water as a part of a government-wide push to address climate change. There was a lot of pushback from Congress, and that proposal got scaled back and then phased out. And then a few years ago, there was a lot of pushback to social and behavioral sciences coming out of the House Science Committee, but that sort of died down after 2018 midterm elections when Democrats took the House. And more recently, within NSF, integrative research in biology and biotechnology and advancing the bioeconomy have been prioritized. So a lot of research in those realms are getting attention and are getting funded. And right now there's a big push towards supporting more technology-focused translational research at NSF and some of the other agencies. So there are a number of examples of situations where policymakers are making decisions about which particular discipline or subdisciplines are getting prioritized. Funding decisions made by Congress also affect what stages of the scientific career pipeline are getting supported. They make decisions about how much money proportionately is going to support undergraduate research versus, graduate fellowship programs or postdoc programs, and how much would go towards early career researchers versus more senior researchers. Government also has influence on how you spend your time as a researcher. What are the regulatory requirements or burdens in terms of paperwork for oversight when you have a grant, or if you're using human research subjects or animal models. Another recent example is that NSF proposed new requirement for grant proposals involving field research. How much time does it take to fill out all that paperwork? Those sorts of things are also, being determined by decisions up in the food chain. And of course, this is especially pertinent at the state level. Elected officials have an impact on what is being taught in science classrooms. A well-known example of this has been the attacks on the teaching of evolution in K through 12 public classrooms. in a number of states. So there's a lot of decision making going on that is of pertinence here. So funding decisions made by Congress have quite a big impact for some, have quite a big impact. And to look at some additional context, let's take this graph shows longer term funding trend. So the graph basically shows federal research and development spending as compared to the size of the US economy, which is measured by the gross domestic product or GDP, which is shown on the y-axis as a percentage here. And on the x-axis, you can see a timeline of about 47 years. So you can see that there have been some ups and downs in terms of this metric over time, but it's largely been a downward trend. And that's true across presidential administrations for the most part. And importantly, federal R&D investments are shrinking as a share of the US economy, just as other nations are increasing their investments. And it is important to note that the US GDP is relatively much larger, but compared to some of the other countries, our federal R&D investment as a share of GDP is relatively lower. In order to remain competitiveness, or to remain competitive, this really needs to increase. Now we'll talk about the federal budget and take a look at where we are headed in terms of funding for biological research and education. So, to start, let's take a look at how your tax dollars are spent by the government. So if you consider every $1 that you give to the government as taxes and see where it goes, a major portion of it is healthcare related, like Medicare and Medicaid. Another big chunk is defense, which is about 15% or so. Then there are domestic programs related to job and social security, which is about 30%. And another major portion of that is interest on the debt, which is about 10%. And then there's everything else in the federal government, such as interior, EPA, education, transportation, that's about 20% or so. And then science is a relatively small part of the budget, about 1%. So federal spending can be classified into two different buckets. One is mandatory spending. These are also, sometimes referred to as entitlement programs or social safety net programs. And it includes things like Social Security and Medicare. Once a mandatory program is created in law and the formula is set for when people qualify for benefits, the government has to pay that out. So Congress, would need to change the underlying law to change mandatory spending. And mandatory spending has been a consistently growing portion of the federal spending over the past decades. Approximately 2/3 of government spending is for mandatory programs, and this is about double of what it was 50 years ago. All other federal programs can be classified under discretionary spending. So this is everything from the military to research and development, environmental conservation, education, transportation, and so on. And for these programs, unlike the mandatory programs, Congress makes annual funding decisions about them through legislation that fund the federal government. And every year, Congress actively decides, say, what level the NSF should be funded at in the coming year. And they make thousands of funding decisions across all the federal departments and agencies and programs within them. And collectively, 12 pieces of legislation fund the federal government. And discretionary programs can then further be divided into defense and non-defense, with most of the science funding that we're interested in as part of this event falling under non-defense discretionary spending. And because mandatory spending has been growing faster than discretionary, this has put pressure on discretionary spending, resulting in it being a fairly smaller portion of the federal budget at this point, roughly a third. Now, it's important to remember that ultimately Congress controls federal spending, including investments in science, and the president's budget request, as you might have heard this term, is just a request that the Congress considers. And there's no central fund for R&D in the government. Funding for research is distributed among a myriad of federal agencies and programs, and that includes the National Science Foundation, National Institutes of Health, NASA, the US Geological Survey, and so on. And work on fiscal year 2024 appropriations, which is the current fiscal year, was completed at the end of March of this year, which was almost 6 months into fiscal year 2024. So Congress basically passed two spending packages, which are often referred to as mini buses, each comprising 6 spending bills. They ended up providing $1.6 trillion in discretionary spending, providing spending cuts or flat funding relative to the previous fiscal year, which is fiscal year 2023, for most science agencies and programs. And notably, in 2024, funding levels were constrained by spending caps that were imposed as part of a debt limit bill that was passed by Congress to avert a US default on debt. So the bill, the spending deal basically put limits on federal spending over the next 2 years. It capped non-defense discretionary spending, which of course includes scientific research funding, at fiscal year 2023 levels for 2024, which means flat funding for 2024, and for 2025, which is the year that we care about for this event, which is the next fiscal year, the discretionary spending will be capped at 1% increase over fiscal year 2024. So basically flat funding in 2024 and then 1% increase in 2025. So looking to 2025's budget, which is next year, many of you might be aware that President Biden released his budget request back in March, and the plan basically provides about 1.6 trillion in discretionary spending overall, with small increases for both defense and non-defense. Now, the request largely adheres to the spending caps, which was negotiated in 2023. Most science agencies in the budget, in the president's request, are slated for increases, but the proposed increases are a lot more conservative than what we've seen from this administration in recent years. So some agencies are slated for slightly larger increases, like NSF, which is looking at a 12% increase, and EPA Science is slated for a 33% boost. But it's important to note that both those agencies received significant cuts in 2024. So if you keep that in mind, the proposed increases are not as large. And you'll note that, I've mentioned on the slide here that there's a detailed analysis of the president's budget request that is available on the AIBS website, if any of you are interested, and I will share that link to resources at several points during the webinar and also included in a follow-up email. But Diane, if you have a second, can you drop the link to the resources page in chat so that people have access?
Will do.
Thanks. Now, with respect to what's going on in Congress, lawmakers have begun work on spending bills for 2025. Both chambers ultimately have to pass 12 appropriations bills. That's what the spending bills are called. And those 12 bills collectively fund the entire US government. So many of those bills have science programs within them. And as of now, the Appropriations Committee within the House, and the Appropriations Committee is basically the group of lawmakers that draft these bills every year. So the Appropriations Committee has approved all 12 appropriations bills for 2025 in the House, and the Senate Appropriations Committee has approved 3 of their bills. The Senate is usually a little slower to take up and write their spending bills, but they have started the process and are not far behind the House. In spite of the spending deal, the 2 legislative chambers are moving in different directions with regards to fiscal year 2025 funding. The House has set funding targets for non-defense significantly below the levels permitted under the debt deal. So they're aiming for roughly 6% below fiscal year 2024 overall. But for defense, they've proposed a 1% increase. And the Senate, on the other hand, has opted for higher funding levels for non-defense discretionary this year so far. And the House bills have been passed through the committees along party lines, while the Senate bills so far have been passed with bipartisan support. So the approach in the 2 chambers are different right now. The House measures, as they're currently drafted, are slated to make significant cuts to many science programs while providing small increases or roughly flat budgets for others. And so far, the Senate appropriators have proposed small increases in some cases and flat budgets in others. Now, after these bills pass the appropriations committees, they go to the full chamber for their consideration and vote. And most, if not all, of these bills will be combined into spending packages before they are passed by each chamber. And the bills that the 2 chambers eventually pass are likely to be very different from each other. And in that case, a conference committee will be appointed to resolve the differences, and the 2 chambers will need to pass the final bill again. And then that bill will go to the president for the signature. Now, all of this needs to happen before the current fiscal year ends on September 30th. So if Congress is not able to pass all the appropriations bills in time, which is what ends up happening most of the times, we will be facing a government shutdown. And in order to avert a shutdown, Congress will then need to pass a temporary measure, also known as a continuing resolution, to keep the government funded on a temporary basis until their appropriations work is complete. So this is why you keep hearing about this, every year that, oh, we're looking at another government shutdown. That's because Congress has rarely completed work on appropriations on time. Now let's look at some of the comparisons in the numbers for 2025. Now, in this table, you can see a comparison of the president's budget request versus any congressional action so far for specific science agencies and programs. Now, the percentages are relative to the total enacted budget in 2024 for each agency or program. So, for example, for NSF, the president has requested a 12% increase compared to 2024, but the House has proposed a 2% increase in their spending bill, and the Senate has yet to release their spending bill. So that's why it's a blank right now. So you don't need to worry about noting down these numbers. We'll be providing these numbers to you along with other talking points for your meeting. So, this is just to kind of give you a sense for what we're looking at, what the outlook is right now. In general, as I said earlier, the president's budget request, like its name suggests, is only a request, and Congress ultimately decides the funding levels, which is an authority granted by the US Constitution. And Congress can decide to allocate smaller or larger funding increases than the ones proposed by President Biden, or even, cut the funding. And you'll see from the president request column that most of the science agencies were slated for boosts in the president request, with one exception, with the USDA Agricultural Research Service. But you'll see increases for the others. So research at NSF, for example, is looking at a 12% increase. The US Geological Survey is looking at an 8% increase. And its Ecosystems Division is also slated for a 9% increase. The Department of Energy Office of Science, 4% boost. Its Biological and Ecological Research, or BER, is looking at a 5% increase. Science at EPA is looking at a major boost of 33%, but then again, the ARS, or the Agricultural Research Service, is a 3% cut, while the Agriculture and Food Research Initiative, which is the flagship competitive grants program of USDA, was slated for a 7% boost. So, in comparison, when you look at the bills being considered in the House, which is the column to the right of the request, you'll see that the story is quite different. The House, in most cases, has proposed either funding cuts or smaller increases in funding. The Senate has yet to release numbers for most of these agencies, but with respect to ag programs, you'll see a small boost proposed for ARS and a flat budget for AFRI. So we'll see how these numbers compare between the two chambers as the process moves forward. The current proposals are meant to be starting points for the months of budget negotiations. These negotiations go on for several months and can potentially extend to the next year after the elections. So there's a decent chance of the process being completed, sometime early next year, or maybe even later next year. So we're not close to the final budget numbers yet, and we're likely going to end up with a compromise package. And there are still opportunities for the science community to weigh in and positively influence the final numbers. And if you're interested in advocating for increased federal support for research during your meeting, we've put together a number of recommended budget asks for different federal agencies. And you'll find these numbers in the fiscal year 2025 budget numbers and asks document that is available on the policy resources page. And most of these asks are numbers that are agreed upon by the scientific community, which is based on recent budget trends and the current political climate, so that we as a community can collectively advocate for the same numbers. So, for example, if you're looking to advocate for NSF, you can go into your meeting with the ask that the lawmakers support funding for the NSF at $11.9 billion in fiscal year 2025. Or if you're going to support NIH, you can ask for the $51.3 billion number. We, of course, recognize that there are spending caps in place for non-defense discretionary funding, and that the likelihood of our specific funding asks being met are low right now. But it is important that we as a community speak out about why these requested increases are needed and urge Congress to fund science agencies at the highest possible amount. An effective way to advocate for science is to meet with your lawmakers, whether federal or state, and whether in DC or back in the district. So as I mentioned earlier, an in-person meeting is incredibly impactful in shaping legislators' views on an issue. And some of you are hosting tours at your research facility, and that is a great way to put a face to the name of a facility and that the legislators had perhaps only heard before. The overarching goal for this event is that you all will be able to show your lawmakers what the direct benefits of science are in their district or state or region. So now what we're going to be focusing on is how do you formulate the right message for the meeting or tour that you're doing, and how do you deliver that message effectively? But first, you need to know who your audience is before you begin. Are you meeting with a federal or state elected official? Are you meeting with their staff? Because in many cases, you won't be able to meet with the lawmaker themselves or have them out for a tour. And in that case, their staff will make themselves available. So it's important to first understand your audience and their points of view. The following tips, the ones we'll just talk about, will apply to, meetings with federal government officials as well, or even university leadership. So let's get into some of the content. So when you're thinking about your audience, you want to start by asking yourself some questions so that you can come up with the right message and content to deliver to them. So who are they? Are they fellow scientists? If you're meeting with an elected official or staff, that is quite unlikely. You have to think about their current knowledge level. In most cases, elected officials and their staff are college graduates or may even have further advanced degrees, but it has probably been years since they took a biology class in high school or as an undergraduate. What are their interests? Find a hook to engage them. Google them or go through their website. Read about what issues they support. Do they have a hobby or something that you could use to capture their interest or to reel them into your discussion? What are their beliefs? Are there inherent conflicts between you and your audience? You need to be aware of their beliefs, particularly if you work on an issue that is considered contentious to some people. So, things like climate change or evolution education or evolution research in general. So, think about any key differences that there might be there. Why should they care about what you have to say? Again, it's helpful to find common interest, some common ground, so that you can present your information in a way that actually engages them and makes them care about it. And maybe they actually do care, but they just haven't made that connection yet. So let's start with who lawmakers are. On this slide, the font size for each of the words is proportional to the number of members of Congress who identify with or are from that profession. So most lawmakers have a background in public service or politics, some in law and business, some in education. And that little smudge there at the bottom that is really hard to read, that is science and engineering. So there are very few lawmakers in Congress that have a formal background in science and engineering, but they are there and they do tend to engage and speak out on those issues. The same is pretty much true for their staff. When we're trying to engage a lawmaker, more often than not, the congressional staff are the people we end up interacting with on a regular basis. So it's good to know who they are and what their background and interests are. And staff are important. They advise their lawmakers. So it's important to engage with them. Congressional staff are generally college students, and many have graduate degrees. College graduates, college graduates, and many have graduate degrees. Although many of them have law degrees or degrees in public policy or political science, they generally don't have science backgrounds unless they are, say, a fellow from AAAS or a Knauss fellow. There are some people who are on detail from federal agencies that are and are temporarily posted in a congressional office. They might have a science background in that case. So you could come across some staff that do have some level of science background, but besides fellows or agency folks, it is generally less likely. Also, I should note here that if you have a meeting with just staff instead of the elected official, don't be surprised with the fact that their staff are quite young, in their 20s or 30s. On average, they have been in their positions for about a year or two in the House, and it's a little longer usually in the Senate. So it's possible that you might be the first person talking to that staff member about a science-related issue. It's just something to keep in mind. To know your audience, it's important to do your research on the lawmaker, even if you're meeting with their staff, because the staff represent the views of their boss. So do a quick Google search to find out, what positions the policymaker has previously taken, on the issue that you're going to be speaking to them about. Whether you're there to talk about funding for NSF or state support for undergraduate education, it's good to know if the lawmaker has put out something on those topics. Check to see if the lawmaker has sponsored or co-sponsored legislation on that topic before. Have they ever written op-eds? What press releases are posted on their website recently? Recent press releases will tell you what issues a lawmaker has been focusing on in the recent few months, or what bills they've sponsored. If you look at their website, in most cases, there will be a page on issues or legislation or something like that that reveals a lot about what issues are a priority for the elected official. And you won't find many members of Congress who list science as an issue on their website, but they might mention something like education. And sometimes what they don't talk about can also be useful in your research. You can also do a general Google search and read any news articles about them, if they've been in the news recently. I'd also encourage you to think outside the box. Look at their biography. Maybe they have their hobbies listed or their interests outside of work. And that can sometimes be really useful. Even their education or professional background and family interests can all be pertinent as you're doing your homework about them. And it's important for us to understand that there are different motivations that guide decisions for policymakers. And these motivations can be broken down into head, heart, and health. Now, some policymakers love studying an issue in detail and coming up with a policy solution. They devour independent research and really appreciate private meetings with knowledgeable experts. A policymaker may also be guided by emotional or personal appeals by a constituent. After a touching story from a constituent, they may feel a bond to them and make a decision based on that. Hearing personal stories can be very important to some lawmakers. And then finally, health. Their political health is also important to them. Politicians need to be re-elected to continue to do good. So they want approval from the public and need to know that something is popular and has public support. They need to know if a certain action will hurt or help their re-election campaign or their ability to advance another priority that is even more significant to them. So there's also a herd mentality to their actions. Most of them don't want to be the first to stick their neck out for something that might be unpopular, especially. So each politician has different relative levels of each of these, and you just need to figure out their major driver and try to feed all three. And you can use this sort of knowledge to formulate your message in an effective way. And you need to understand, what their current level of knowledge is on a particular issue. And from what you've gathered from your research or, through your conversations with them so far or their staff, do they understand all the dimensions of the issue? And even if they're knowledgeable, they may have different perceptions. So then there is the challenge of overcoming their existing perceptions on a particular issue. Ultimately, what you want to do is to take the person's current knowledge level and their perceptions of a topic and connect the dots with what you want to share with them. And it's challenging to overcome somebody's perceptions, but this is where you can try to find common ground and common interests. For example, if a lawmaker you're meeting with says in their bio that they're interested in fishing, fishing is listed as a hobby that they're really interested in, that would be a great place to start when talking about your water quality research or any conservation-related research that you're doing. Another example would be, if you're coming in to talk about funding levels for a research program and the lawmaker has not listed science or investments in their R&D as an issue on their website, you might start by talking about how research investments have impacted economic development in their region. You can try to make a connection by talking about how science helps to, support jobs and training of future skilled workers. And because your goal is really to tailor your message based on the views of your audience and based on the homework that you've done about them, you don't need to necessarily change your ask or your position when talking to different lawmakers, but you can adjust how you argue for your position. You don't want to change your facts. You just want to pull forward and highlight different facts or use different examples to sort of make your point. So I'm going to give you an extreme example. If you're speaking about climate change action, you would approach the topic differently if speaking to staff in Senator Markey's office versus Senator Tommy Tuberville's office. So Markey thoroughly understands the issue and is a supporter of the government taking action to mitigate climate change, whereas Tuberville questions climate science and has even said that God causes climate change. So with Markey, you can get straight to the findings of your research and you can expect him to understand and be supportive. With Tuberville, you do not want to spend a lot of time talking about the science, but focus on how conditions are changing and how that has real economic impact. So you can make the argument that there are some innovative technologies that can be deployed that could grow jobs and benefit the state and create new economic opportunities that could replace any jobs that were lost in the oil and gas sector. And that's how you would kind of refocus how you talk about that issue. So you can see how you would need to take a slightly different tact with those two offices, even though you're ultimately trying to convey the same message. In the end, it's important to remember that all politics are local. And for all members of Congress, it comes down to what's going on in their district or in their home state, what's of interest to the people who are going to be re-electing them, and how can they serve that interest. Particularly in the House, while the representatives are voting on national policy issues, they're all looking at it in terms of what it means to their electorate, to their district, to their local communities. Does it hurt them or does it provide them with an opportunity to solve a problem? So the more you can draw upon local examples or point to specific instances, your area of work impacts that lawmaker's district, the better the message is going to resonate with them. And once you figured out who your audience is, you have an idea of what kind of message might resonate with them, it's important to think about how you should actually communicate that message. So you want to remember that facts do not necessarily change the mind of elected officials. Policymakers need to consider a lot of different factors when making decisions about a particular piece of legislation or the issues that they're going to take up. And facts are certainly one of them, but so are their own personal beliefs and the pressures that they're getting from their party leadership. So, the views of their constituents and their donors are also an important factor. And so is, economic costs. What are the economic costs? What are the trade-offs with other issues that they might care more about? So if you just come in with some great statistics and talk about your research, that might not necessarily be enough to change the lawmaker's mind on an issue. It is imperative that scientists think about a different way to present information, especially when meeting with lawmakers. As scientists, we are very focused on the methodology. When we ask researchers to describe their work or what they do, they often start to talk about how they're studying something, which is the process or the technique that they're using. And they tend to get into the specifics of their research. But that's how we're trained to talk about our work. And the advice we like to give is, instead of focusing on how you did your research, focus instead on why you do it, and think of that as a new communication paradigm. So for example, if I want to describe my own graduate research from several years ago, as a scientist, I would want to say, I use fluorescent labeling and confocal microscopy to study the formation of lignin in plant cell walls. And that's an exaggerated example, but that is very focused on the how of what I'm doing or the methodology. But I would really encourage you to think about why. Why are you doing what you're doing? Why is this research interesting or important? So if I want to reframe the earlier description, I could say, I study how plants make their cell walls to improve the efficiency and lower the costs of producing biofuels. Similarly, I'd encourage you to think about the bigger picture and the broader implications of your work. And here are some broader implications your work might have. As biologists or environmental researchers or scientists in general, it's usually fairly easy for us to find resonance with things like health or environment, food, energy, economy. So think about how even the most fundamental or basic research work might connect to one of those higher order issues of interest, and then use that to formulate your messaging. You don't need to go for all of these, of course, but if you can find resonance with one or two with your research, that would be great. And you should also keep in mind that lawmakers are increasingly looking at issues through an ideological or partisan lens. So they're probably much more aware of how their constituents and voters in their district feel about an issue, and they'll be concerned about being out of step with what those voters are thinking about. So think about this as you frame your message. A tool that we recommend as you are preparing your content for the meeting is called the communications triangle, which is shown here on the screen. The basic idea is to help you come up with the summary of what you want to say. And it's good to recognize that you're not going to share everything you know about a topic in a given meeting. So you'll actually be most impactful if you start with the big picture and get them to internalize that. So that's in the middle of the triangle. This is called your main message. And you can think of it as like a headline or a big idea. And then you can support the big idea with 3 talking points that support that main message, why it's important and why it matters. So I'd encourage you to try to write a main message that's 140 characters or less. That's the original length of or the length of an original tweet. It's not a hard and fast rule, but a good, general guideline. If you aren't able to distill down your primary objective for having that meeting to something that short, you might need to keep trimming your message. And you can have more flexibility with the talking points. In general, though, I would stick to 3 talking points because it's easier for people to retain 3 pieces of information. And retention really tends to drop off if you have more than 3 points. But you can have, of course, you can reinforce your talking points with things like, you can back them up with things like a story or a statistic or an example or some kind of combination of those things. I'd also encourage you to think about how you will transition between those talking points as you're preparing your message. And if you can, tell a good story and include human elements when appropriate. You can also include data in the story. So for example, if you're telling a story, you can tell a story about a constituent who was impacted in their district. For example, someone from the fishing industry being impacted by ocean acidification. That might resonate better than a generic comment about, ocean acidification harming bivalves. So think about, at the end of the day, these meetings are short and really, you don't have a lot of time. So if there's a way for your message to resonate with them, using a story or that human angle can be very effective. And, they're not going to have the time or capacity to do a deep dive into an issue. So you really want to leave them with the big picture and try to get them interested enough so that they'll come back to you later for more information. So I can go over a couple of example messages here, first for a federal lawmaker, and then on the next slide, I'll talk about the state lawmaker. So many of you signed up for this event to talk about funding for a federal research program. So this example triangle is based on that. So if the big idea is that federal support for biological research is important to the country, your first talking point may be something about how public investments in research pay off and that it generates new discoveries and innovations that improve the lives of Americans, creates jobs, as well as new patents that help to advance the US globally. You can mention how your state or your university benefits from these investments and provide 1 or 2 examples. And then you might transition to talking about how that funding is incredibly competitive to receive and that many programs have low funding rates. Even though many of the grant proposals submitted are highly rated, there isn't enough funding available. And then you can sort of transition to the last point about how more predictable and sustained funding is needed to allow American innovation to continue to thrive. And that's, sort of a really condensed version of what those talking points could look like to give you an idea of how to sort of use this triangle when you're coming up with your message. And I'll also note here that we have more detailed talking points, sample talking points that are available on the resources page that I just mentioned. From that resources page, you can download some, general talking points as well as talking points relevant for natural history collections. So, if you work at a natural history museum or botanic garden, there are also some other resources that you might find helpful on that resources page. Now, another example, if the message was intended for a state official around support from the state for undergraduate science education, you would now want to focus on things that are within the state's purview, such as preparing the next generation of workers and how your university plays or your institution plays a part in that. Perhaps by providing research opportunities to undergrad students or how grad school is helping to prepare the STEM workforce for the future. And then you might want to use a personal story to talk about, students that you've trained, or maybe how an undergraduate research opportunity motivated you or enabled you to pursue a career in science. Stories like that are a really great tool, and they resonate really well with many elected officials. So it's something that they can really wrap their heads around and can be more effective than numbers or statistics in these cases. At the end of the day, the content is going to vary a lot from person to person, and a diverse group of people with varied interests have signed up for this event. So the examples I just talked about were just that, examples. Feel free to customize that triangle based on your own research and interests and what you described in your registration forms. And again, there are a few More examples such as, funding for NSF Bio drives innovation and promotes discovery, or funding for USDA competitive research grants are important avenues to, address food security and environmental sustainability. So all of these, the triangle can be customized based on what message you want to tell from your perspective. Now let's talk about the structure of these meetings. So if you've not done an office meeting with an elected official before, you might be surprised that the meetings tend to be fairly short, usually about 15 minutes, but they can be as short as 5 minutes and typically don't go more than 30 minutes. It might be a bit different for district office meetings, which might go on for a little bit longer, but than a meeting on the Hill. But in general, expect these meetings to be pretty short. And because these meetings are short, you should plan on getting to the point quickly. So when you first get to the meeting, you should start by introducing yourself, exchanging business cards. Business cards are still an important part of congressional meetings, and most meetings start with this. So remember to bring those and provide them to whoever you're meeting with. I would encourage you to start with a thank you. It can be as simple as, thank you for taking the time to meet with me. But perhaps, based on your homework of the elected official, you may have something more specific. For example, you might say something like, I really appreciate that the senator has been a consistent supporter of research funding, or, that he or she voted to increase funding for NIH or NSF in the last appropriation cycle. You can be more specific and thank them for particular legislation that they have supported or co-sponsored. Those are great. So for example, if they voted in favor of the CHIPS and Science Act or co-sponsored the, Recovering America's Wildlife Act or something like that, you can mention that in your thank yous. And that just, starting the meeting with a thank you just starts it off on a positive note. Then you will communicate your message, the one that you've developed using your communications triangle. If you're advocating for funding for an agency and have a budget ask, make sure you bring that up at the start. So we're here to ask you to fund the National Science Foundation at $11.9 billion in 2025, and this is why. So, and then you can kind of go through your talking points. And, feel free to bring along some handouts or leave behinds to these meetings. Here's a couple of examples of handouts. There are one-page handouts that are already prepared and available for your use on the AIBS policy resources page. And so you'll see on the left here, we have a handout that talks about the importance of government investments in biology and how that pays off for the nation. And on the right is a handout about place-based biological research, for example, at field stations and museums and botanic gardens, and what role they play in research. And you're welcome to print these out and take them to your in-person office meetings, or you can share them with the lawmaker or staff you're meeting with over email prior to your meeting, and you're welcome to make your own. If you have a one-page flyer about your research lab or your group or your museum or whatever, you're welcome to, make something of your own, but just remember to keep it, very concise, and it shouldn't be a long 5-page document or anything like that. And, so feel free to provide handouts to whoever you're meeting with. And it's usually good practice to take one or two, not too many things, if you are planning to take some handouts. You certainly want to allow time for dialogue and questions. It shouldn't be just you dominating the conversation and using up all the time yourself. Use that opportunity to meet with them to learn about what that office is, thinks on a particular issue. So it's use that opportunity to learn something. As the meeting wraps up, you can also offer to be of service again in the future, because this really is an opportunity for you to build a relationship with that office. It's not just a one-time transactional type of thing. And lastly, you can thank them again for meeting with you. And remember, it's good to enter a conversation expecting to learn something. You certainly have information that you're going to be sharing with the folks that you're meeting with, but you can also learn things from them during the course of that meeting. So some of these questions, as listed here, you might have already been able to answer from your research, but most likely not all of them. So for example, where is the policymaker on a specific issue? Are they supportive? Are they opposed? Are they ambivalent? What can you share with them that will help them better understand the issue? Do they have particular concerns about the bill that you might want to talk to them about? Maybe they have concerns about trade-offs with other areas that are higher priority for them. Are they hearing from other groups who are opposed to your issue or other groups that support it? Are there other things that are currently taking higher priority? Is there another group that hasn't weighed in but could be influential with them? For instance, the university president or teachers union or someone else might have a lot of influence. So that's an opportunity to think about building coalitions. Now, really, view this as a conversation and as a give and take of information. So that will really go a long way in building a relationship and having an impact on policy. Because in the end, it is really about building a relationship. And something that has happened time and again is that, one meeting with a particular office has led to another, and participants have sort of started off with their first interaction with the lawmaker's office at the staff level meeting, as a staff level meeting, maybe as a part of this event, but then that has led to meetings with elected officials directly or to tours of research facilities down the road with the lawmaker themselves. So the relationship might even extend to you being able to weigh in on legislation that the office is drafting, or becoming a resource to that office on that topic sort of going forward. So we certainly hope that you all will be interested in staying engaged in science policy and building upon your experiences this summer and fall with continued interactions with these offices in the future. Now, for anyone who is still a little bit uncertain or unclear about what one of these meetings might look like, especially if you've never done one before, we have an example of a mock congressional meeting posted on the AIBS website. And again, this is the same policy resources page. So this, mock meeting is a bit of a generic meeting, but it might be helpful for folks who are meeting with their congressional district office. So feel free to check that video out. Now, we have some participants who are interested in arranging tours at their research facilities, and the tips I provided earlier about how to prepare your messaging pertains to tours as well. But of course, the meeting structure is very different. So the big difference is length. Typically, these tours we hear last anywhere from an hour up to half a day and sometimes even a full day. It's important to be upfront about some of these details. You just need to make sure that you clarify the duration of the tour when you're in the process of scheduling the visit with the lawmaker staff, so that everyone is clear on what the expectations are, and also so that you can prepare the right amount of content for that length of time. So I also encourage you to think about some other details. Where are you going to have the lawmaker or staff or whoever is coming meet you? Try to find a place that is going to be easy enough for them to find and hopefully represent your facility well. You should decide on what the route is and what the stops are in advance. So that's especially important if you have a lawmaker coming out who might have health issues, or maybe of a more advanced age. A few years ago, we had an issue where the lawmaker was recovering from a surgery. So the university ended up arranging for a golf cart to pick her up at her car, basically, and then drive her to the facility. So they also tried to minimize any standing or walking time to sort of accommodate her health issues. So those are things to think about and ask the staff about as well prior to the tour. If there are going to be multiple people from your facility who will be speaking, which is a great thing, and we certainly encourage that, just make sure that you, coordinate your messaging with them. So you want to plan out, how much time each person has, what topics will be covered by each person, and the sequence in which the topics will be covered, so that there's no overlap and all the right context is being provided for each of the stops. And lastly, I'd like to definitely advise you to get your government relations people or public affairs people involved. You don't want them surprised when your elected official shows up on campus or at the facility, so they need to be part of that process. And we also have additional tips available in a handout on that resources page if you're planning to host a tour. So check those out. Again, I cannot emphasize enough how important it is to prepare, and this involves not only learning about the background of your legislator, but also having a couple of quick facts available at your fingertips when you go into these meetings. So you could perhaps talk about economic or societal benefits of your research to your particular district or university or organization, and that could be anything from the amount of research funding the university receives each year to how many students you train in your own lab. Your personal examples are great too. You can talk about your own experience of applying for grants or being a graduate student and what that graduate research fellowship meant to you, those sorts of things. I'd also recommend that you think about how to handle the situation if things go a little bit south and you get some pushback or some tough questions. That likely will not be the case for most of you, even if you're meeting with a lawmaker or their staff who've not always been friendly on particular issues. These meetings are typically, they're civil and, you don't need to worry about, things kind of going out of hand. But for the most part, you're the constituent, which, in that case, they would definitely want to be polite, even if they don't agree with you. But do think about the policy implications of your research if they're going to be trying to, if they try to cast some doubt about the science or give some pushback about the cost of programs. Those sorts of things should be, you should prepare some kind of response if those type of questions come up. Here are a few tips to help you communicate effectively. So as I mentioned, these meetings are short, so you want to be prepared and you want to get to the point quickly and be really succinct in your message. Try to stay on message. This is where the communications triangle comes in. So that you're prepared, even if you get some questions that are outside the realm of what you wanted to talk about. And you certainly can answer those questions, but by the end of the meeting, you'd want to try to bring the conversation back to your big idea. And repetition is key. Make sure you plug in your main message or your ask at the beginning and at the end of the conversation so that it sticks. And I'd also encourage you to have a conversational tone and pace. So, as if you're speaking with a friend, we want to try to avoid scientific jargon and acronyms, all that stuff, even for, things that you might think are obvious. If you think you're going to talk about NSFs, say the National Science Foundation. If the staff or lawmaker that you're talking to themselves say NSF, then you're okay to use that acronym. They know what NSF is. But otherwise, it's best to avoid any acronyms. Same for scientific jargon. It's going to vary, of course, depending on your audience, but assume that the member of Congress or their staff are at the level of undergraduate students in terms of science. And you just want to be positive and respectful. You want to leave them with a good impression of you in general. And I cannot emphasize enough the importance of effective communication and having the right message for the right audience. So doing the background research for understanding your audience is certainly key. There are some pitfalls you want to avoid. You want to avoid partisanship. Most offices aren't going to go there, but they might. If that happens, you don't want to say anything that might reflect poorly on your employer. You want to politely find a way to steer the conversation to more neutral ground. And if you get any questions that you don't know the answer to, you can definitely say that and say that you don't know or you're not comfortable answering that, but you might know someone who might be able to, and you can offer to put them in touch. For some of you, depending on what your employer's policies are on interacting with elected officials, you might need to clarify. You might need to do the meeting as yourself and not as an employee of the university or institution. So you want to make sure that you clarify that in advance. Excuse me. And some other things to avoid, don't bring too many handouts or leave behinds with you. I mentioned earlier that you're welcome to bring some documents, but I would encourage you to limit that to 1 or 2 things. And scientific papers are not the right thing to bring to these kinds of meetings. And please take the time to look at the documents that are on the AIBS resources page to get a sense for, what are some appropriate documents. I would also advise against making any unrealistic demands or suggesting other programs to cut to increase funding for yours. If they ask you to suggest a program to cut, you can just say politely that it's a decision for the lawmaker to make and you're here to just talk about the benefits of your program. Lastly, I'll just say that the staff are really important. They advise the lawmakers. So if ultimately you're not offered a meeting with the lawmaker themselves, it is still very much worth your time to take the staff level meeting and, to bring them out to your institution for a tour. And in case you're wondering about what you should wear, I can talk about that just a little bit. If you're meeting in the district office, business attire is appropriate. So both those pictures were taken in Washington, D.C. during our annual Congressional Visits Day, and these folks are dressed appropriately with everybody in formal attire, and the same will apply for district office meetings. And of course, a tour is going to be probably a little more casual. Both these pictures are from tours that happened a few years ago. In both pictures, the person on the left is the member of Congress and the person on the right is the researcher. And as you can see, something like button-down shirt or polo shirt with khakis is appropriate. And I'll also note that if you're planning to bring people out to a field site or something like that, just give the office a heads up and let them know if they need to wear anything in particular. For example, they might need to wear a hat to protect themselves from the sun, or need to wear sneakers or hiking boots or something. Especially if there's a lot of walking involved in uneven ground. So you just want to be clear about that up front, because otherwise they'll assume that they will be walking on nice level ground and not have to worry about weather conditions and that sort of thing. So make sure you provide all of that information ahead of time. And now we'll get into questions in a bit, but before that, just let me mention a few logistical things regarding meeting scheduling. We're now working on reaching out to participants about scheduling meetings. We will be working with each of you directly to submit a meeting request. If you haven't already, you'll very soon be getting an email from me or another AIBS staff about submitting meeting requests. I would encourage you to respond as quickly as possible. We will basically be working with you to determine, what office you're meeting with, what type of meeting you're interested in arranging. And once, you and I over email have agreed on these specifics and any other details like, time frame, I'll submit the meeting request and then let you know once I've submitted the request. And in all cases, the participant, which is you, will be listed as the point of contact for scheduling. So when you hear back from that office, please respond to them and take care of scheduling the actual meeting from that point on. So, but we also want you to keep AIBS in the loop and let us know once a meeting or tour has been set up. In most cases, you can, the meeting will be requested as an email, so you can leave us copied on that email so that we're aware of, where the scheduling process is and we can assist as needed. And if it so happens that, a few weeks go by and you don't hear anything from the office, in that case, do let us know so that we can follow up with the office and check where things are. And after you've had your meeting or your tour, I'd encourage you to send a thank you note to the person that you met with. It can be a note in the mail or it can be an email, either is fine. It doesn't hurt to remind them about what you talked about, but, briefly in a sentence or two. And if you promise them any follow-up information, do remember to include that in your note. And if we at AIBS would also love to learn about how your meetings go. So do write to us and let us know about your experience. If you took any pictures like the ones you saw a few slides ago, we'd love to see, those as well. And you can share those with me over email. You could also share photos on social media. That's a lot of our participants have done that in the past. You can post it to X or Twitter. And if you do post on X, please do tag us at AIBS Biology. And we hope that you'll stay engaged after this event. Several of you opted to sign up to receive action alerts as part of the AIBS Legislative Action Center, and I hope that the rest of you will also consider that. You can just do that on our website and sign up from there. It's a great way to stay engaged and take action on any legislative issues related to science policy. We also have a free electronic newsletter called the AIBS Public Policy Report, which goes out every 2 weeks on Mondays. We very much encourage all of you to sign up for that to stay current on science policy issues. You can also do that on the AIBS website, or you can drop me an email and I'll make sure that you're signed up for it. And as we conclude, I just want to say another thank you to our event sponsors for their facilitation of this event and making it possible for all of you to be involved in science advocacy. And with that, we can go to questions, and I'll note that again, the policy resources page has several additional resources in addition to what I sort of talked about in this presentation, which will be the slides and the recording will be posted on the policy resources page. And the other sort of resources that are available include sample talking points, which are some general ones, as well as collections focused ones. that you're welcome to look at and pick and choose the ones that you feel most comfortable, talking to. There's also a document with relevant budget numbers and recommended budget asks, which some of you would hopefully find useful. And then there are some example kind of leave behind handouts that you're welcome to print and take to your meetings. So with that, we will go to questions. I will stop sharing my screen so that I can look at you all.
We do have a question in the chat, Jitsa.
Okay.
And it's, should the handouts be pre-approved by AIBS?
It would be great. I mean, I would love to see a handout if you're planning to take one to your meeting. I would love to see it, and just to kind of see if it's appropriate kind of content for a congressional meeting, but it's not necessary that, you don't need approval from us. We can provide advice and recommendations, maybe some suggestions, but yeah, it's not mandatory that you get it approved. Rick, you have a question?
Well, more of a comment for people who may not have done this before. I've done lobbying for several years now for the Friends Committee on National Legislation, and it can be very intimidating when you first do something like this. But you have to remember that the legislators and the staff are meeting with you because they want information about, what it is you're telling them. And their sources of information are pretty minimal because most constituents don't reach out to them. So, don't be too worried about it. It will, they really, are receptive to hearing from you. So that's really my comment.
Well, that's a great point, Rick, that, most of them are not hearing a lot from scientists. So never hesitate, never, and always assume that they don't have any background information. But once you have a chance to meet with them, you get a better sense for, where they are in terms of, getting engagement from other scientists. And in a lot of cases, because, if you're meeting in DC, you'll get the staff that is generally responsible for science, right? Each staff within the U.S. House has a number of issues that they're dealing with, and science is usually not going to be the only issue. They probably have 8 other issues that they're covering for their boss. So if they're handling science issues, they would at least have they will have some background information and knowledge about what you might want to talk about. But in a lot of cases, you get a different staff. Like, okay, the science person was not available, so you get to meet with a different staffer. And then have a conversation with them. In that case, you just want to keep your talking points to a minimal and make sure you share follow-up information with them so that they can share that information with the relevant staffer and their boss. So that's something to be aware of as well. Any other questions? Oh, something in chat. To be honest, all 3. So I'll repeat the question. And Nico's asking if there are trade-offs between meeting in DC and in the district office and maybe at organizing a tour. There are benefits to all 3, right? If a scientist is taking the time to travel to DC to meet with them on the Hill, that shows to the lawmaker that, that this issue is really important to this person. And this is a constituent, and this constituent cares about this issue enough to take the time and effort to travel to DC to come to meet with them. So it is really effective. It is an effective way to engage with an office for sure. And a huge advantage of organizing a tour is that you get the lawmaker, at your facility for an extended period of time. And that's really a great opportunity for you to really show what's going on at your museum or in your lab or your research facility. So, and they love those opportunities too. Whenever lawmakers come out to do tours or visits, they'll usually have staff accompanying them who are there to take photographs and then put those photographs out in their newsletter to their other constituents. So it's really a nice opportunity for them too, to kind of be seen engaging with their constituents in different parts of their district. So it's a really nice opportunity to personalize some of those interactions and spend more time with their staff and the actual lawmaker. The district office meetings are great too, because the staff in the district office are very different from the staff in the DC office. So you want to be able to, like, if you want to build a long-term relationship, it's good to know and have interactions with staff at both the district and DC offices so that you become a familiar face to them. So, I mean, I think, ideally you want to be doing all of it, not at the same time, but, maybe this year you want to do a district office meeting, and at the district office meeting, you could suggest that they come out for a tour next year or, in a few months. And then we have our DC event in spring of next year. So if you can travel to DC and participate in our Congressional Visits Day, you have the opportunity to kind of join other scientists from your state or neighboring states in meetings with different lawmakers. So that's another, different kind of opportunity to be part of a bigger event where there are multiple people on your team and you're going to meet with different lawmakers, sometimes even 7-8 offices in a day. And the benefit of doing these meetings in the spring is that that's at that point lawmakers are still in the process of gathering information before they start writing their appropriations bills. So that's a really strategically important time to go and weigh in on budgets. But summer is good too, because right now congressional offices they're starting to release their proposals and pass the initial kind of drafts of these bills. And we're going to be moving into the negotiation phase. So it's good for us as scientists to check in at this point as well and weigh it in terms of, okay, we're happy with these numbers or we're not happy with these numbers. We think this number should be higher, kind of thing. Yeah. All right, other questions? And if not, I will be, emailing with each of the participants. So any specific kind of questions that you might have about, what to cover in these meetings, what to talk about, we can always get some of that stuff discussed when the time comes. Thank you, Rick. Appreciate it. Well, if there are no other questions, thank you all for joining, and I will be in touch very soon with each of you about your meetings, as well as some follow-up sort of links and links to the recording and things like that, so that you have all of that information in place